Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. This is episode 34, believe it or not. We're really going full force with the forum this year. And we have a very special guest. His name is ter Maat, and he is a Libertarian candidate run for the office of the President of the United States in 2024. He previously ran for the U.S. House in the state of Florida in District 20 in 2021, and he obtained his PhD in economics at the George Washington University. And I want to welcome him to the show, and I appreciate you accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Kiko. No, I appreciate you reaching out. It's a joy to be with you today.
Yes, we have quite a bit to talk about. Before we get too much into the bio, I have to mention when I saw your site, the two things that stuck out, I think when you go to Mike ter Maat's website, is Austrian economist, and then it says pro-reform police officer. And so that's kind of, I was like, wow, let me look into this a little bit more. That's kind of how I found out about you. I was just browsing the internet, and I go to Ballotpedia a lot to find people who are running for public office. But
Sure.
I wanted to get a feel of how did you grow up? Where are you from? And what's been your journey leading us to this point of running for president of the United States?
I appreciate that. I don't know that it's the most interesting part of your show today, talking about my background, but I'll give you the condensed version to spare your audience as much of the most boring part as possible. I've had basically two careers, each oriented in various ways around public policy. The first was as an economist. I was a professional economist for over a couple of decades. I started out in banking. After getting out of engineering school and then later on business school, I went to work for a couple of banks, went back to graduate school, as you mentioned, at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where I studied economics. And I studied at what we call a rational expectations school, which means it is a philosophical descendant of the Chicago school, with which more people are slightly familiar, which itself is a descendant, philosophically speaking, of the Austrian school of economics, which is to say a natural skepticism of government intervention in the economy, a recognition that the economy works better when markets are allowed to do their thing. Rational expectations in particular means that individuals take into consideration what they expect the government to do, and in no small part that in the long run serves to effectively nullify what it is the government is trying to do in terms of intervening in markets, particularly monetary policy, and push things one direction or another. So it's a real pro-market environment. I moved to Washington a billion years ago, in the mid or late 80s, when I was in my mid or late 20s, thinking, and Kiko, you'll appreciate this, I wanted to move to Washington to make the world a better place, right? You know, when you were a young conservative economist in those days, the idea was, if only I could get into the federal government and help them make better decisions and help push a pro-market philosophy, surely people would be able to make better decisions and the world would work better and everyone would make more money and it would just be a better earth on which we would live, right? And of course, as it turns out, the blob of Washington is a very discouraging place, in the sense that it's hard to feel like you make a difference. But what really turned me off in the years that I was there, I was in Washington for probably 15 years. What really was discouraging was learning that even your party, I was a member of the Republican Party in those days, did not have a real deep investment in even what it was saying about fiscal conservatism. These were the days of George Herbert Walker Bush.
Oh, yeah.
Read my lips, no new taxes, which sounded good when you're all of I guess 27 at the time that he said that. But I was working for the White House a couple of years later, and he had said, basically, just kidding, when effectively, when he agreed to new taxes in negotiation over the budget with Capitol Hill. That was a discouraging moment. And I think for me personally, it was all downhill from there in terms of having faith in government institutions doing the right thing in the long run. And then, as you mentioned, my second career was as a police officer. I moved to Washington, from Washington to Florida, spent 20 years down there. I spent 11 years as a police officer in Broward County. I was on the road all of that time and working as a training officer. And that is an interesting experience. I'm a big believer in public service, not just in public policy development, but in public service generally. And so it was a good experience from that standpoint. You do, as a police officer, fall in love with your community, whether you intend to or not. That is something that really happens. You care, right? You take offense when there's crime committed against, your people, right?
Hmm.
And you really want to do right by the people you get to know in your area, in your town. So all of that is true and good. And at the same time, that was around the same time as I registered with the Libertarian Party, registered as a voting Libertarian back in around 2010 and 11. At the same time, you do get discouraged by the fact that police officers are all paid the same, whether they're, great at their job or crappy at their job. There's a big buffer in terms of accountability between police performance and the impact on police officers themselves. Unions have shut down a lot of that. I believe that has to change. I would like I think we would all like it if local politicians did a better job of representing communities' interests when negotiating with police to gain greater control and more community involvement in the hiring, training, firing process. But I'm not optimistic that's going to happen, which is why I'm a big believer in replacing qualified immunity with a third-party private sector liability insurance provider. Bringing in someone from the outside, I believe, would provide a check on the system and bring some accountability, so that in the long run, what we need to do is get police management, the business of policing, to look more like that in other industries, where the good police officers get paid more, the mediocre get paid less, and the bad ones get fired, or at least priced out of the market because the liability insurance would be too high. So that's in a nutshell what I've been doing the past 50 years. I should say 40 years. Not quite that old, but
See, I'm glad I asked that question. It wasn't as boring as you thought it would be, because you answered a couple of my questions about sort of how your shifts politically happened, and you explained that around 2010 or so you became a libertarian and you grew up as a young conservative economist. But you already touched on police reform issues, and I had a question about that. You talked about ending qualified immunity, and I actually spoke with Shaki Nichols. She's running as unaffiliated for president too, and we talked a lot about police reform. And she agrees that ending qualified immunity, or at least sunsetting it, is probably the best thing to do. Um,
yeah.
I was looking at a questionnaire that you took when you were running for the U.S. House, and you said that defunding the police um, is not a serious proposition. What do you mean by that? Can you sort of elaborate on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's really serious in the sense that it's neither a good idea nor something that anybody really supports that's deeply involved in public policy. I think it's not going anywhere. I think it's mostly sloganeering. It's an expression of being anti-cop. And I think that there are a lot of people in the United States who are anti-cop. I mean, I completely understand the frustration when you see, for example, videos of police officers doing the wrong thing. I think it's, humanly natural to have a, super negative reaction to that, right? Who wants that sort of thing? particularly who wants that sort of thing on the public dollar or
Mm-hmm.
in the name of your community. It just makes it all the worse. So I completely understand the emotional reaction to it. Nobody likes, least of all, fellow cop, right? I mean, of all the bad things that can be said about the bad behaviors from time to time of police officers, imagine it's even worse if you're a cop and you know the difference between good police work and bad police work, and when you see bad police work, you know it's going to hurt you in the long run too. So I've got no tolerance for that. But the truth of the matter is that our society cannot get rid of our need for police. We do need to get rid of our war on drugs, so the criminalization, the criminal prohibition on drugs, which would change a few things. But in the main, we are not anytime soon getting rid of our need for police officers. So the idea is not to reduce the budget, but to make our management of police officers more effective,
Mm-hmm.
more accountable, more transparent, more flexible is a big one. One of the things that I think that we need to do to advance our cause in this regard is promote the idea that police agencies should be as small as possible and replaceable as possible. In other words,
Mm.
there should be more competition among agencies for providing those services to each town or county. In the city that I worked for in Broward County, Florida, we basically only had two options. We were lucky to have two. A lot of places don't even have two options, right? We had two options. One was the local police department, and one was the county sheriff's office. So if the mayor and the board decided they didn't like the way that their police department was being run, they could replace the chief and the leadership. But another option they had would be to dump the entire agency and invite the sheriff's office to police the town instead. And they did consider that from time to time, which put not only cost pressure on the agency, which is appropriate, but alerted everyone in the agency to the idea that if we didn't do as good a job as we could be easily replaced.
Mm.
And that certainly would get your attention, and
Mm.
and that is a good thing, whether it's public schools or public police departments or any other business in the world. Competition is one of the most important ways to keep businesses operating as effectively as they possibly can. So there's a lot that we need to do in terms of managing police officers, all moving in the direction of improving police culture. Uh, Police culture is something that needs to be improved. In some places, it's pretty good. In some places, it's not very good at all. I believe that we are making progress slowly over the years, but we have a long ways to go.
I think some of the stuff you said, it definitely resonates with my audience. There's been so much talk, and you alluded to this earlier. I guess the volatility behind the term defund the police. Myself personally, um, I'm on board with that message, but at the same time, I'm very open to differences of opinion about it. I think at the very least, and I will agree with you on this, I think the very least that people are serious about police reform is that they could end immunity. At the very least, because that to me that shows like a good faith um, of holding people accountable. I think that's a very rational view to have, is to at least hold people accountable. And then the other stuff we can discuss it, but I think that that's a starting base where people can sort of come on board. Like I say that to my friends who are a lot more into the I won't say anti-police, but they're very hard on pushing to defund the police. And like I said, I'm sort of complicit in that too, but I'm also more open to reaching across the aisle when it comes to that issue. So I'm glad you
Well,
specified
I
that.
certainly appreciate the feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anytime,
Yeah.
for example, sometimes I get mad at public schools, right? Because they don't do a very good job. I think that the teachers unions get in the way of real effective management of teachers. But I don't think that the right solution there is necessarily fewer teachers.
Right.
I mean, we could, I'm certain that we could make progress if we had more effective teaching. Could we do with fewer teachers? Maybe, maybe. But that's a fairly granular decision. Could we do with fewer police officers? In some cases, yeah, absolutely. Um, but that's not the bulk of our problem is not that we have too many teachers or too many cops. The bulk of our problem is we need to do a better job of managing them, a better job of recruiting the type that we want, training them in a way that better reflects our community values, holding them accountable, evaluating what's a good cop, what's a good teacher, what's a bad cop, and then being able to pay them in a differentiated fashion and get rid of the bad ones.
Hmm.
So yeah, there are places where we have too many teachers and too many cops. There may be places where we have too few cops and too few teachers. But
Hmm.
the issue is, the bigger issue is, how do you get the most out of each one of those individuals and make sure that you get rid of the ones that really shouldn't be in the business?
And I think that's an interesting argument you brought up there about you compared the teachers union with the police unions. I never really even thought about like that before, and just the idea of, yes, I mean, certain areas may need more or less depending on the situation. So no, and that's why I kind of learn with the audience and the guests, because this is a process. I think we have to open ourselves up to learning together, and that's the only way I feel like we're going to advance is this dialogue that's going to be needed more and more. But we see that the divisiveness is sort of encouraged now to help the two-party system.
I
And
agree.
and that's the and that kind of goes into everything else with these culture wars and censorship issues that are constantly happening. So no, I'm definitely on board with a lot
I
of what.
agree. I think you put your finger on something really interesting in the sense that the divisiveness is part and parcel of the two-party system. In other words, I think the divisiveness is not just something that naturally grows out of the two-party system, which it does, but it also contributes to the two-party system as they like it, as they
Hmm.
see it, and helps propagate it. Each of I'm obviously a few hundred years older than you are, but I can remember when the Democratic Party was much more adherent to its philosophical agenda, and the
Hmm.
Republican Party was much more adherent to its philosophical agenda than today. Today, uh, I would argue that each party's number one platform plank is to keep the other out of power.
Oh, for sure, absolutely, no doubt.
Absolutely. And, I remember certainly I was a kid in the late 60s, but certainly in the early 70s, you could find Democrats who were really committed against war,
Hmm.
right? Just per se anti-war. I don't mean around the edges we can argue about what the right Ukraine policy is.
Exactly.
I mean, they were anti-war, right? Like I and other libertarians are today. And you could find even as late as the 80s, maybe even early 90s, hardcore Republican fiscal conservatives, the
Hmm.
kind of people who really wanted to hold the line on spending come hell or high water, just do anything it took to control spending. You don't find that anymore.
No.
You'll find some Republicans giving the Democratic administration a hard time about, well, maybe we shouldn't spend $2 trillion more. This was literally the argument 2 years ago. Maybe we should only spend $1 trillion extra. I mean, I'm sorry. If you're a libertarian and you're actually hardcore worried about the amount of money we spend and the amount of debt that we accumulate and the amount of inflation we generate, that is not a worthwhile distinction between a Republican and a Democrat.
Hmm.
And Kiko, this is where authoritarianism comes from in a democracy. People often wonder, well, how does a democracy move toward authoritarianism? It comes from the idea that each party's leaders play to nothing but their base and then convince people, which you have to fear is not so much the loss of your individual liberties. What you really have to fear is that other idiot coming to power. And I can protect you from that if you give me more power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it comes from.
Oh yeah, I've tried to explain to my audience, and we had Margaret Kimberly on in episode 4, and we've had Spike on a couple of times. Spike
I'm a
Coleman.
big Spike fan, by the way.
I am too, and I'm a big Margaret Kimberly fan. The thing about me, I've told my audience they know that I identify as a libertarian, but I'm a left libertarian. But
Sure.
I
So
know that
is Spike, I think.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. We were
Well, we'll let
debating
him
that
defend
about it.
himself then. We'll let him defend himself.
Yeah, he calls it being more libertarian. That's what he called it. That's the way he characterized it. But it's some of the stuff you said about the anti-war. It's like now, someone like myself, I consider myself someone that's on the left, like the real left. Somehow the Democrats have co-opted what the left is, and like you said, they used to stand for stuff like anti, like all the things that you would think of a left is standing for. Like they're totally in line with the corporate like system. They're all
Yeah.
about funding more wars and everything, just like the Republicans. I mean, it's like they're just
Yeah.
in bed together, but they have different colors on the sheet.
No, they're totally on board with sending $100 billion of stuff to Ukraine and, the Raytheons of the world
Oh
getting
yeah, no doubt.
disgustingly rich over it. They're all about it. The Democrats look very much like Republicans used to look, and the Republicans are way out there now in terms of projecting power around the world. It used to be, this is funny, I just remembered this. It used to be that Republicans would talk about, well, someday we're going to be able to save a lot of money because we'll be the big power in the world, right? When we win the Cold War, there'll be what we peace dividend. You remember that phrase? You're probably too young to remember that phrase.
I've heard of it.
We were all supposed to get a peace dividend. We were supposed to save a lot of money because we would have defeated the other important imperialistic powers. And therefore, we wouldn't need a military as big as we used to think that we needed. That never happened. Our military spending never did go down. It just keeps going up and up and up. And then we were told, boy, this is a trip down memory lane. This is really I'm irritating myself at this point just by remembering this stuff. Then we were told we were going to save a lot of money because of technology, that we could project power and defend ourselves in means that were high tech, right? That wouldn't require such expensive things like ships and tanks and people. And that didn't happen either. We keep spending more and more money, even though we're more high tech than ever before.
Yeah, that's definitely a point that you make on your positions and on the site. And we're going to talk about monetary policy and your views about this is the part where I think I may have some disagreement with you is the decentralization aspect. First of all, I guess before we talk about monetary policy and stuff, I want to get a clarification on what is decentralization. What does that mean? Because I've heard that word thrown out a lot lately.
Well, what it means, at least what it means to libertarians, what it means to me, is pushing power down from the federal government to state governments, from state governments to local governments, and from local governments to people, so that decisions are made as locally as possible. Some decisions are inappropriate at the most local level. You wouldn't expect your counties to decide how to defend the United States.
Right.
So I get that we're not going to push everything down to the local level, but we want to limit government power and push as much back to people, to citizens as possible. And to the extent to which power must reside with governments, and we can all argue about how much or how little that is, we want the decisions to be made at as local a level as possible. So as as one small but important example, even if you believe that the government had to play a role in education, which we can argue about, I think in the long run, government will not be in the business of education. But even if you thought that the government did have to play a role in education, we believe that the federal government is the inappropriate place for that to happen. It should be pushed to states for them to manage as they see fit. And we would go one step further and encourage states to devolve that down to school board level. School boards ought to be able to make decisions for themselves, which in the main they are today. But we saw, for example, in Florida, Governor DeSantis moving legislation that tied the hands of school boards because he wanted, he and the Republican legislature in Florida wanted to impress upon school boards they wouldn't be allowed to teach certain things, wouldn't be allowed to include certain books. And maybe you agree with all of that philosophy, maybe you disagree, but my point is we would prefer those decisions be allowed to the school boards.
Mm-hmm.
And further to that point, we would encourage school boards to do as good a job as possible at listening to parents.
Mm-hmm.
Parents are the ones that ought to be making as many decisions as possible, recognizing you can't make every decision through parents. You can't call a parent every 10 minutes and say, you know, how should I teach lesson number 3 in the math book?
Right.
But you can listen to parents when it comes to what kinds of things ought to be discussed, maybe even the way certain things are discussed, which topics, which books they do or do not want in the school library. One of the things that we need to remember in all this book debate in school libraries is that school libraries don't include every book in the world, right? They include a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of all the books in the world. And so someone needs to decide which books, right?
Right.
We don't want the federal government deciding, we don't want the president deciding which books, you know, some school in Seattle ought to have and which books some school in Orlando, Florida ought to have. Nor do we want the Department of Education making that decision. We don't want the governor of Florida or the governor of any other state making those decisions. The school boards ought to be making those decisions in conjunction with feedback from their parents. And this is why school board officials are typically elected so that they're responsive to their communities. And we believe that's the way it should work. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I like the way you explained that. I just have one question about the school board dynamic and the parents and everything. I didn't hear anything about the teachers. What do you think about the teachers having input in that if they're teaching the course?
Well, of course, and teachers naturally do because they have so much control in the classroom. But it's important to remember, just like police officers, we're employees, right? Police officers are employees of the community, and teachers are employees of their communities. Yes, a police officer and a teacher, they have enormous discretion. One of the things I was actually surprised by when I became a police officer is the enormous amount of discretion you have over how do you handle any particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's not a good thing. We can get into that, right? I mean, we all appreciate it when a police officer employs discretion at saying, no, I'm not going to arrest this person. This is someone who needs a lecture and to be told not to do it again, right? But we want the officer to make the right decision and arrest someone who really, sometimes people need to go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
Enormous amounts of discretion there. Teachers have an enormous amount of discretion about how to teach certain topics, you know, what words to use, where directions of discussion go. But we need the community's voices to be reflected in the management of cops and teachers. So yeah, all of those people are stakeholders, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Just like police agencies, schools need more competition. Right now, the public schools have an enormous advantage in most communities, not every community. In most communities, public schools have an enormous advantage over other schools because the money that's raised by government to pay for schools so often only goes to public schools, which is really a horrible, horrible thing from an economic viewpoint. There's no logical reason, there's no ethical reason, there's no economic efficiency reason why you would restrict the money that's collected to pay for kids' education to only go to public schools instead of any school the parent wanted. And it's a very weird thing that we've come to accept in the United States. And we need to get rid of that. I think it's arguably our number one public policy problem in the United States is the monopoly that so many public schools have over their communities. They need, just like police departments, they need to feel like if they're not doing a great job, they can be easily replaced. And that's not the case today in either police agencies or too often in public schools.
Interesting. Does the school choice thing, that's another topic that I've really I haven't, I'm sort of underdeveloped in, I guess, having a view on it because
Right.
I've always seen it as, well, wouldn't it just create a vacuum somewhere else if you have a preference of school, um, and you have more people going to one school than the other one, and then that school is kind of left, like stranded in a way, like that's kind of what I guess that would be my blind spot or gray area when it comes to
No,
that.
no, no. Yeah, I appreciate that, but it works. It should work like any other market. There's nothing, I mean, car dealerships, we don't say, well, we need to protect the car dealerships because if someone else starts a car dealership, what's going to happen to the old one? No, that's not how we think. I mean, I feel bad for the employees of the crappy car dealership that got run out of business because they weren't providing good service. That stinks. But they'll have to go to work for the new car dealership. And the old car dealership, that floor space will be empty if they go out of business, and someone else will turn it into either a restaurant or turn it into a new car dealership. And that's the way it has to work in this case too. And by the way, the most important thing that teachers unions don't understand, and there's no real reason why they should understand it. If they haven't studied economics or other businesses, they would naturally miss this. The most important thing they don't understand is teachers will make more money when there is greater competition for their services. In other words, most teachers today, the vast majority of teachers in the United States, do not have more than one agency competing for their service.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in Broward County, Florida, you are largely beholden to whatever Broward County wants to pay you.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to work for Palm Beach County if you want to commute really far or move, right? Or Dade County if you want to commute really far or move. But they pretty much got a monopsony over what they're willing to pay you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had a complete choice of where parents can send their kids, you would have real competition among private schools and between private schools and public schools, and people would want the best teachers. But
Mm-hmm.
private schools today try to save every penny where they can because they're strapped for cash. They don't have access to public funding. And so you see teachers, in many cases, some of the most fantastic teachers at the private schools getting paid very little money compared to public school teachers. And it's because they just don't have the budgets. But imagine if you had multiple providers competing for the best cops, the best teachers, I got to tell you, competition drives up that competition. Where you see in places like South Florida, where there's quite a few police agencies, not for any one town, but in all of South Florida,
Mm-hmm.
there is some serious competition to bring in brand new officers. There's people willing to pay 70, 80, $90,000 for a beginning police officer. Those are numbers that are starting to turn into real money, right? That's not the case typically for teachers. And then what happens is, right. And then what happens is after you're hired, it's very difficult to change. They've got you. You're
Mm-hmm.
developing a career. Maybe your pension is tied up with your agency. Geographically, if you're a teacher, your school board controls a big geographic area. So you'd have to move if you want to change jobs. These are the things that hold back your compensation. And then the unions, boy, they really do not do public employees a service when they demand that everyone get paid the same. A 6-year
Mm-hmm.
officer gets paid this, period. No matter how crappy he or she is, no matter what kind of a star he or she is, that's how much you get paid. Same
Mm-hmm.
thing with the teacher.
Mm.
But imagine if you're the type of person who really wants to do a good job, it can be very discouraging and you're not going to get paid for it. You're going to go 80,000, 85, 90, 95, 100, which
Mm-hmm.
is good money, right? But imagine if you got rid of the crappy ones.
I wish I could hear those numbers that you just said, because I'm in the arts and humanities, and so
Uh,
we're
you'll go your
underfunded
whole
as it is.
lifetime without making that kind of money.
We're underfunded as it is. But something that you said about there's a bifurcation in academia, and see, I can't really speak much to I can only speak to higher ed because that's all I've ever taught. Um,
Right.
I can't really speak about secondary as much, but there's a friction between administration and teachers. And I think that's where we see the leveling. Like a lot of we teachers, like we don't feel like the deans and stuff should be getting paid as much as, I mean, we're really, like you said, a lot of the students would prefer me at some of the community colleges I taught at, but I was still leveled out as, okay, he's just an adjunct professor, whatever. While the people above me are making so much money. But
Yeah.
and I'm really the reason why the students are taking the course. Like they're sitting out
Bingo.
2 semesters because they want to take Kiko as the professor.
Yeah.
And so it's
This will, agreed. This will not always be the case. It will probably be the case. Well, let's put it this way. It will certainly be the case in my lifetime. It will probably, unfortunately, be the case for the rest of your lifetime. But someday, probably toward the end of this century, people are going to get much better at evaluating good education versus bad education. Today, and for the last 400 years, certainly for the last 300 years, what matters in college is the reputation of the institution, right?
Mhm.
Which you're paying for up until very recently was nothing but the name of the school on your diploma. Well, and you're paying for an education, but you really had no idea, especially if you're 18 coming out of high school, you have no way to evaluate how good the education is going to be. You just trusted, well, Harvard's famous. Everyone says it's the greatest. I'm sure my education is going to be great. I don't have a good way of knowing whether it's going to be better or worse than another school.
Yeah.
Uh, but someday we will be better at this. Just like we're better, to offer a silly example, we're better at evaluating restaurants than we used to be.
Hmm.
Right? You can go online and read what 100 people said about the diner down the block. More information than I want, right? I don't need everyone's criticism of the French fries 7 miles away from my house. But if you want it, you can get it.
Mhm.
And now we have some information about schools that's better than what it used to be. We have some information about teachers. There's probably online forums that'll talk about, what a good job you do in your class. And when you piss somebody off, there'll be a negative comment in there. Oh, Professor Kiko said something stupid in class today. Everybody boycott his course, right?
Right.
It goes both ways. It goes both ways, unfortunately. Well, as it should. But someday we'll do a much better job of evaluating what it is that makes education valuable. And people will be more willing to pay for those things that creates value in education. And that's when there'll be more competition for the teachers that create that value. Up until now, what really drove compensation for professors would not be for guys like you and me. I taught economics at 3 different universities myself, but always as an adjunct
Mhm.
while doing something else, right? But what really drives compensation for professors is research that brings in research funding to the university. It's all about the coin. It's not about the education. You could be pretty mediocre. You could be pretty bad in a classroom
Mhm.
and be a highly paid, fully tenured professor making 6 figures even 15 years ago. You could be making $100,000 as a full professor with tenure at a state university and be crappy in the classroom
Mhm.
just because you did a good job of bringing money to the university. And that's what they were competing for. That's the professors they wanted.
Mhm.
And I believe this system is going through change now.
It is.
And 20 and 40 years from now, there'll be real competition for people who want to be good teachers, both in elementary school, high school, but also in higher education too. For your sake, I hope it's sooner rather than later.
Oh well, I have 1 foot in and 1 foot out right now, but I'm really taking this time to just sort of breathe, honestly, because I've recently got a PhD, and so I'm just sort of evaluating my options right now. But
Yeah,
I have a passion to teach, but it's a process. And it's really hard being in the humanities and the arts. A lot of my colleagues are leaving academia because of there's not a lot of incentive to
you
continue.
don't bring in research funding, and that means that the only value to your employer is in terms of bringing in tuition paying students, and they don't have a way of evaluating what a good teacher is and what a bad teacher is. So you're just a cog in the machine.
Hmm.
That's the way it is. Same thing with high school and elementary school teachers, same thing with cops.
Yeah, and it makes you not. And see, it takes away the art of teaching, and then everything's about research, everything's about scholarship. And yeah, it definitely
Agreed.
creates a whole nother set of issues. But
Yeah.
I want to go back to the decentralization element, and only because I read the 2 essays you had posted on your site, where within the Libertarian Party, even not, there's a debate as far as there's some people who are like, they think that we need to divorce our federal government, and there's some people who think that no, we don't need to do that because that would be that's not libertarianism. I'm kind of I was thinking about the consolidation of power more so than anything when you were talking about state control. That's always scared me when I hear things going back to the states because to me, I definitely agree that the government has too much power, like the federal government. But wouldn't there be a danger of the state just consolidating power just like the federal government?
Yes.
Which is just another form of statism, really.
Is it okay if we agree? Yeah, that is
Okay.
that is a problem. Um, the issue is, well, yes, that's a worry. There's no getting around that. In fact, devolve all of the power all the way down to your county and still find a problem, right? I mean, you get some jerk as your county administrator, you're in a world of hurt.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no silver bullet from stopping schmucks trying to run your life in government. There's just no silver bullet. And that's why we need to design systems that explicitly limit that power as much as possible. Now, the reason that we like the idea of decentralization is because we believe in two things that might matter. One is we think that you probably have a little bit more control over your state house than you do over Washington. This is not always the case, but a little bit more control. Okay, that's number one. Number two, and yeah, when that's not the case, that stinks. And I'm not going to argue with you, right? Number two, to the extent to which there are cultural differences across the states. And with regard to some issues, there's big differences. And with regard to other issues, there's, no difference at all. But when there are important cultural differences across the states, we think it's inappropriate for a federal government to make up its mind and impose a solution on everybody. So, when to pick two big examples, when Texas and Massachusetts disagree, why is it that the federal government should be settling that debate for them and imposing a solution on them? I don't think that's appropriate. Then the other reason is the old argument, which I believe is true, even though it's an old argument, that states need to be what we call laboratories, right? That we need to allow 50 different solutions to see which ones stink. It used to be, the line would be, try 50 different solutions and see which ones work best. But as a libertarian, I find that most government solutions stink. So what we're really trying to do is figure out which ones stink worse so we can stop doing those. So, for example, to pick something that's really controversial lately, especially in states' rights, if a couple of very culturally conservative states decide we don't like abortion being legal, Texas is going to take one approach. You've seen where they even open certain participants in the process to civil liability. A lot of people don't like that, right? Some people in Texas don't like it. A lot of people in other states think it's insane. But there are other conservative states who also don't like abortion being legal, who might try a different approach. And over time, we will see how it actually works in practice. Is the Texas approach as insane as some people fear? Probably. To be honest, probably. But I could be wrong about that. Maybe it'll work out better than what we think it will, and we'll learn something from that. The other thing about it, going back to the imposition of solutions on people, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of all people, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote 30 years ago that is, whatever you may feel about Roe v. Wade, and we all have opinions on Roe v. Wade, however you feel, you have to admit, I'm paraphrasing, this is not exactly how she put it, but it's her idea, so I can't take credit for it. However you feel about it, you have to admit that by imposing one view nationally on every state, you preclude each state the opportunity to work it out for themselves. Okay, now maybe you don't, maybe that bothers you, maybe it doesn't bother you, maybe you don't like the way your state legislature would go, so you're okay with your state legislature having its hands tied. But consider if you're in the minority view in your state, you know, is that really how you want to settle a debate? Is by, oh, good, the national government told the majority of people in my state to go shove it, so I got my way.
Right.
That's not democracy. That's not politics. That's not even protecting civil rights. That's just getting lucky, right? That's just having a federal government that agreed with you. So, Judge Ginsburg's point was, when you preclude each state the opportunity to work it out, that subverts the political process. Okay, maybe that's a big thing, maybe it's not. But look, fast forward 50 years. Roe v. Wade falls. By the way, as a technical matter, however you feel about abortion, as a technical matter, I believe that decision was decided correctly, that Roe v. Wade should not have been allowed to withstand judicial scrutiny. That, and I'm not arguing the underlying facts,
Right.
but as a
Right.
technical matter, I think the judges probably decided that correctly, that Roe v. Wade had to fall. But having said that, now you have this explosion of states figuring out what to do, and everyone's mad because you're taking 50 years of bottled up political
Right.
feeling, and
Mm-hmm.
you got to decide now.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an easy thing to do. So, however you feel about abortion, that's the argument for decentralization, is that
Mm-hmm.
each state should be trying to figure out its own approach to this. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes. I don't want to focus too much on this because but it's also a good thing because I'm grasping, the concepts a lot more. I know my audience will appreciate that too because we're all thinking through this together. But I did want you to sort of elaborate on this gold new deal because when I hear the word gold, I was thinking the currency. Like, I'm like, is he
Right.
talking about going back on the gold standard? Which I wouldn't be totally opposed against, because we have to do something with just this printing of the money is just is
Yeah.
insane right now. And
Yeah.
you have quite a few tenets when it comes to this gold new deal. Where does this come from? The gold new deal, is this something that you coined, or is that from FDR and you just sort of made it your thing and made it Mike ter Maat's sort of
Well,
philosophy?
yeah, we made our campaign invented it. We're poking fun at the New Deal a little bit.
Right.
We're poking fun at the Green New Deal a little bit. But the idea, first of all, gold is a double entendre, right? It's the color of the Libertarian Party,
Hmm.
as opposed to blue or red for the Democrats and Republicans. The Libertarians are gold. Uh, and it is a bit of a double entendre in the sense that reminds you of the gold standard. That's okay.
Mm.
And that speaks to the fact that we do want to get back to a rules-based monetary policy. I wouldn't go all the way back to a gold standard, but I would go in that direction toward what I call rules-based. We can talk about that. But the reason that we're going after the New Deal language is because we believe that we need a real fundamental change to the relationship between government and Americans, which is what the New Deal brought in the 1930s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We believe that he went the wrong direction in the type of change he made
Hmm.
in that relationship. So we want to go uh, ahead toward the type of relationship that would be more appropriate, where Americans have more control over their lives, where states have more control over their political futures. So the Gold New Deal talks about, first of all, decentralization, devolving power to the states. So the idea there is states would have a constitutional option if we were to have our way. Not suggesting this is easy to pull off, by the way, but we would want the states to have a way of opting out of federal supremacy for laws and executive orders coming in the future. So to the extent to which there was discrepancy between federal law and state law, a state would be able to settle that in its own court, in state court.
Okay.
Would be able to effectively nullify federal law that was in contradiction, except for those very few things like national defense that are explicitly mentioned in specific actual language in the Constitution. But for everything else, states should be able to chart their own political futures. And then underneath that, we talk a lot about the ways in which the relationship should change. For example, I find it inappropriate that the federal government, the last 100 years or so, has been able to tax individuals and individual corporations. This is a relatively recent thing in American history. 100 years is a long time, but it's not forever. We should not have an organization like the IRS, which, as we all know, as anyone in your audience who's ever been audited by the IRS knows, is one of the most powerful police organizations in the world.
Oh, no doubt.
They have their own courts. They have their own courts where you are presumed guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. The IRS is always presumed right, and you need to battle against that. That's an uphill climb. We believe that a more appropriate way for the federal government to raise money is to go to the states, to go to the state legislatures themselves. And this is not only because I don't like the direct relationship between individuals and the federal government in terms of money, but also because states are better able to stand up to the federal government. So when the federal government says we need $3 trillion, states will be able to negotiate them down. Not easily, right? That's not easy. I'm not suggesting any of this is easy. But a state legislature, particularly in conjunction with its other fellow states' legislatures, would have a lot more ability to negotiate with the federal government than you and I do. If the federal government said, you know, Kiko, you owe us $10,000, and Mike, you owe us another $10,000, no amount of you and I getting together with 7 of our buddies and writing a nasty letter to Washington is going to get us. Yeah, I don't think so. I'll give you 8,500 because I think that the defense budget is too big. That letter is not getting traction.
No.
Right? It's just not. Indeed, I think that you could probably have several 100,000 people on that letter as signatories, and we're still not getting
anything.
Whereas, if you had 26 state governors say, you know what, we discussed this in the legislature and we don't think so. Now you're talking about a conversation that would be very difficult for the federal Congress to disregard. You get where I'm going?
Yep.
The other, and remember, this all comes from a place of libertarianism, believing that the government has too much power and too much of our money. If, on the other hand, you believe that the federal government should have more money and more power, then maybe you like the system the way it is. So remember where I'm coming from. Similarly, I believe that it's far too easy for the government to go to war.
Oh, definitely.
You know, you notice that most of our military conflicts, the president just engages himself and, you know, has a phone call with a handful of leaders in Congress. You know, you get the gang of 8 on a conference call and you tell the Nancy Pelosi's of the world and the Mitch McConnells of the world, you know, we're going to invade Iraq. And they're like, how come? Well, for this reason. Oh, okay. Ciao, ciao. All right, good night. Everyone hangs up. That's only a slight exaggeration. That's basically the rubric for developing the protocol for how this works. It stinks. So our idea under the Golden New Deal is to say, look, every military intervention ought to have a declaration of war, which means a formal engagement by U.S. Congress. And any declaration of war should be subject to the approval of the states. If you can't convince a majority of states, legislatures, and governors that we should be going to war, maybe we shouldn't be going to war. That's for us, this is a really important point, because we believe that the American people have not been served well by a federal government that does not appreciate our basic values. I would argue that there really are not examples of military interventions in which the U.S. military has participated that people would point to and say, that was a good idea. You know, it cost us this many billions, or in the case of Iraq, $1 trillion. It cost us this many lives, Americans and foreign lives. But nonetheless, we think that was a good idea. There really aren't those examples. There really aren't. We have not been served well. Whatever you might say about the U.S. military, about how good it is at tactical things, very good at blowing things up, death and destruction, very good at moving material, weapons, people from one place to another, very good at controlling land, controlling seas, very good at projecting power, very good at protecting our borders. Having said all of that, the American military has not achieved what you would call long-term strategic success in terms of advancing America's interests in the world. I don't think you can argue the world is a better place for the United States having invaded Iraq or Afghanistan. And I worry very much that a dozen years from now, we're going to say the same thing about Ukraine. And make no mistake, the United States is at war. This is no longer merely a proxy war with Russia, which it is, but it's not merely proxy in the sense that it's not just Ukrainians. It's $100 billion of Mike and Kiko's money and money from all your listeners. And hopefully your listeners have more money than you and I do, so they're putting more money in than we are. It's not just their money. And by the way, we're producing stuff just for the Ukrainians at this point. This isn't like old Jeeps and, you know, half-used weapon systems sitting out in the back behind the warehouses in the cornfields. No, we're producing brand new stuff just for the cause, just as we would for any other war in which we were engaged. And we have almost 1,000 troops there today that are serving in advisory capacities, teaching people how to use the weapons, right? Because you can't just send this stuff over there and expect, well, everyone's going to automatically know how to read the manuals in English and learn how to use them on their own. So we've got people, we've got money, we've got goods, weapons, intelligence. We provide intelligence that we collect with our satellite technology, drone technology, overflight, camera technology. This is all collected, processed, and delivered by U.S. troops and contractors. We're at war. And I fear very much that because this is not something that was ever central to American strategic interests, we're going to lament this soon and for a long, long time.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I definitely, I definitely can see that side more as far as the spending. But see, I guess I would argue as a leftist, and I think this is where coalition building is really important. This issue of war is like this is a dire straight situation. Um, and even and it actually makes it more reasonable for leftists and libertarians across stripes to work together because I mean, you talk about climate crisis. Well, war is the number one contributor to environmental destruction.
Oh,
So,
absolutely it
so
is.
all
That's
this
a
stuff
really
is
interesting point.
intersectional in nature. Like these issues go hand in hand, and when you have that much money going outside of our economy, when we could be arguing basically about what programs you want over here, well, we can't even have that discussion because the money's been spent somewhere else. I mean, it's just and
It's a terrible thing.
and that's something as a basis, and that's why I urge my listeners to stop writing off people who share very important principle views like this. I mean, because a lot of my audience probably do identify as like people on the left and not this Democratic Party blue left, this fake left stuff.
Right.
But and we
Yeah.
really have to work across ideologies, and in this case, an issue this important, we can't be arguing and stuff about it. We just need to find some
I
kind of way
I
to
agree with
coalition
you
building, just keep
100%.
building with it. Yeah.
I was real proud of our Libertarian Party leadership a month ago when they helped form a coalition
Mm-hmm.
with the People's Party. The People's Party not being a group I had much awareness of. It's a group
Mm-hmm.
that grew out of the Bernie Sanders movement,
Yeah.
not a group of folks I typically ran with, right? Um, but the Libertarian Party, the People's Party came together, formed a coalition with a bunch of other like-minded people when it came to war, anti-war,
Mm-hmm.
and put on a rally in Washington called the Rage Against the War Machine. Couple thousand, 3,000 people were there. A lot of media attention. People like Ron Paul and Tulsi Gabbard were there. Uh, it was a real good rally. Like I say, the media attention alone was worth it, but just the ability to demonstrate to each other that we can form coalitions
Mm-hmm.
when we find a particular issue on which we agree, we need to go for it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can't be punching each other in the face because we have some disagreement over abortion or what we should be spending money on regarding social security when we all agree, you know, we need to stop the United States going to war every 10 minutes. Let's fight that battle together where
Mm-hmm.
we can join hands. So I agree with you 100%. That was a real important demonstration rally, not only demonstrating against the war, but demonstrating that we can form important coalitions.
And yeah, and there's a lot of that going on too. And the mainstream's not going to show that. There was another rally recently, the Answer Coalition, which is more of the left wing alliances, Party of Socialism and Liberation, the Green Party. A lot of those people, co-pink people, um,
Yeah, yeah,
they
yeah.
put
The
that
Green
on
Party was at the anti-war rally.
exactly.
I met Jill Stein.
Yeah, Jill Stein, Medea Benjamin, one of the co-founders of Co-Pink, she was there. But there was so much conflict within Co-Pink. They basically told her like, you're going there, whatever that's going to be. You're representing yourself. You're not representing us. And see, that's too much of that going on. And I think that's all this pressure to sort of cater to whatever audience. You don't want to ostracize this group, but you want to keep this group intact. I just think that that's bad. um if you're anti-war, you're anti-war. It shouldn't matter who's with you. And I just
Agreed.
I see this stuff going on constantly, and they wonder why we can't defeat the duopoly is because they're playing basically into their hands at that point when you're separated just more and
Absolutely.
more and more.
Absolutely. And a huge opportunity for us in 2024, for example. So yeah, we need to get much better at that sort of thing. You know, you brought up another issue where I believe that we can form more coalitions. Uh, you know, we were talking monetary policy. And you were saying, for example, you could see yourself potentially supporting going all the way back to the gold standard. My feeling is I spent a lot of time around the Federal Reserve, not as an employee, but I was in the banking industry for a long time. I worked for the White House for a couple of years, and I worked as a free market advocate inside financial services for quite a few years after that. And then later on, I had my own business educating bankers before teaching economics in universities. I spent a lot of time on regulatory issues with Federal Reserve economists, and I got a lot of respect for these people. Very smart, very hardworking people that want to do the right thing. Indeed, I met with the Federal Reserve Board in the boardroom itself, and I had my research on the banking industry cited publicly by the Federal Reserve Chairman.
Mm,
So I don't mean to throw these people under the bus, but that institution is utterly incapable of living up to the mandate that we as a society have given to it. It just can't be done. We need to relieve them of this obligation and take away the discretion that they have with which to exert monetary policy and replace it with rules. Now, we can all argue about what that rule should be, right? My favorite, and the way I think that we should go, is a Milton Friedman idea from the 1980s that says you increase the amount of money stock in the economy by a fixed rate every year. Something that would be approximately 2 or 3 or 4% because the economy grows at approximately that rate. Our population grows a little bit. So you'd want it to be something along those lines. It almost doesn't matter what the number is, as long as it doesn't change. And
mm,
that way, when you saw price increases, you would know it's because the economy is heating up. And if you saw some deflation, you would understand the reason for that too. And there'd be an automatic adjustment mechanism there. And that's the way that we would want it to work. And it would give people the chance to use that pricing mechanism. You know, in economics, we talk all the time about how important it is for markets to work, including the market for money. And so you would know why prices were changing. You wouldn't have to say to yourself, well, is it, you know, because the Fed is doing something weird this month or weird last year, and constantly guessing. That's one of the
mm,
things that really undermines the way that money markets work and the way the banking system works is the change and the unpredictability of Federal Reserve monetary policy. So I would get rid of the Federal Reserve system.
mm-hmm,
I would replace that monetary policy mechanism with a rules-based system. I would get rid of all these bank bailouts. I would get rid of the Fed balance sheet and transfer it to the Treasury Department and make it subject to federal law, which would make it much more difficult to bail out these institutions because you'd have to pass a law to do it. No silver bullet, but as you know, it's hard for Congress to agree on much.
mm-hmm,
So it would at least slow down the process instead of the Fed just one night in the middle of the night saying, well, we got a $20 trillion balance sheet. We can bail out anybody we want. That's not the way we want this to work. And then I would change the way regulation is managed as well. Most banks do have options about who regulates them. In fact, all banks have an option about who regulates them. And I would give them another option, which is to say no regulation at all. Most banks wouldn't take us up on that because they all believe they need a regulator to give them a good housekeeping seal of approval, right? But I believe that some institutions would try a private sector auditor instead of a regulator. And I would like to see that put into place. So there's a lot that we can do to get rid of the Fed, to reduce its power. And that is really the nexus of what drives inflation in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to get rid of that. And of course, we need to cap federal spending. Spending is what drives taxation. It feeds inflation. It undermines markets, and we need to get rid of it. We can't be building debt on top of debt on top of debt that your children and my grandchildren will have to deal with, and their children will have to deal with for a century to come. It's very, very dangerous. All of this, to your point, are different planks in the Gold New Deal platform.
Mike, I tell you, I wish we could talk longer, but I definitely have some places to go this afternoon, unfortunately. But I do want to have you back on the forum, and I was going to ask
I would
you,
love that.
would you be open to having a presidential discussion debate with other candidates?
Yeah, absolutely. Outside of the Libertarian Party, inside the Libertarian Party, some of your important connections are outside the Libertarian Party, with other independent folks and folks that represent other parties.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be a tremendous amount of fun. And I think your audience might enjoy that too.
I do too. And we're in conjunction with 2 or 3 other channels right now. We're trying to iron out the details, and we want to do that also before the I guess the primary start with the parties. And so I
Yeah,
guess
let's do it
sometime
later
this
on this
summer.
year. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
let's do it in 2023. Don't wait until 2024.
Oh no, we're not going to wait to 2024. Yeah. So people's names and stuff are already out there, and the visibility aspect is really that is the ultimate uphill battle for people running outside of the Dempublican, is what I call it,
Yeah.
Dempublican Party. Just and then the
The
media.
Libertarian Party, my party, we do have ballot access. We've got a couple of real challenges in some specific states. But by and large, last time we had 50 state ballot access.
That's awesome.
It is awesome. And so as far as the non-Republican Democrats go, we're the big player. We are really, I think the best way to look at it is the smaller of the 3 parties that has total ballot access.
Okay.
And that's why I believe that we have such an important opportunity in 2024. Having said all that, yeah, I think a debate with other folks seeking their party's nominations for president would be a lot of fun. I think you should invite a Republican and a Democrat too, but I don't think they'll take you up on your offer.
I tell you, Mike, that's the one thing I really, and I've had people to come on that they probably do represent one of those camps, but on my forum, I feel like they just already have too much spotlight as it is, and so I have no interest.
The hell with
really...
them.
Exactly. I'm like, they have their outlets and stuff. People,
they don't invite us into their groups.
No doubt. Exactly. They see it as like, oh gosh, we're going to assist them and elevate them more. So
I take it back. I don't know what I was thinking.
Let's focus on building from the outside and see if it can grow. But how would my audience reach you in case they had a question or a comment and they want to keep in touch with you? What would be the easiest way?
2 websites, my email address. The website is miketermaat.com. Of course, you'd have to spell it right, which would be a challenge. It's MikeTermaat.com. You can email me at mike@miketermaat.com. You can go to see the platform at goldnewdeal.org. Don't go to goldnewdeal.com because they'll try to sell you something, which is not necessarily a bad idea, but it's not our website. goldnewdeal.org is where you can read about just the platform that we're running on. That's real important. And if you go on miketermaat.com, you like what you see, you can sign up to volunteer if you feel like it. We need folks to help us with outreach, of course.
Mhm.
If you got a few dollars that are in your pocket and really annoying you and you want to get rid of that, there's a way to do that at mytermat.com. So it's very fun. It's got videos and stuff written up there and links, and it's as much fun as a political website can be.
It is a very dynamic and it's a creative website for sure. And I enjoyed navigating through it. And I would definitely link all that information in the descriptions of the episode. Beautiful people, this was a great episode 33, um, 34 actually. Yeah, we have so many coming out, and then we have next week, for instance. We have Tina Landis. She's going to be coming on to talk about the climate and environment. We have Cecilia Prado that's going to talk about some labor movements and just activity that's going on around Nashville, Tennessee. We have my dissertation director, Dawn Duke, promoting her new book, Mayaya Rising, along a panel with 4 people in the upcoming month of April. We have Norman Finkelstein coming on later in April to discuss his new book as well. We have so many professors, activists, politicians coming out to the forum, and we really appreciate just all the attention and all the dedication to the listeners and the guests. And Mike, again, I can't thank you enough for accepting the invitation, and we can't wait to have you back on.
Absolutely, my joy. Thank you so much. I'm grateful for the time that we had together. I look forward to it in the future.
Definitely. Thank you so much, beautiful people. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.